Welcome to Seeds for Our Future, Conversations and Explorations. Today with Yifat Susskind, Executive Director of Madre. Yifat is a lifelong human rights activist. For more than 20 years, she has worked with women on the front lines of war and climate breakdown to organize feminist responses to disaster. Under Yifat's leadership, Madre has enabled local women's rights activists in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Palestine, Colombia, Haiti, Sudan, Nepal, the Philippines, Nicaragua, and beyond to survive and thrive. Madre helps women around the world rebuild their lives and communities, making their voices heard in the halls of power, from village councils to the UN Security Council. Yifat's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post. Her TED Talk in December 2019, Thinking Like a Mother, has garnered close to 2 million views. We wanted to talk to Yifat today because her work is so vast around the globe, and she's working with organizations that we normally think of as not very empowered, but who carry their empowerment forward in wonderful ways and give us hope in planting seeds for our future. Welcome, Yifat. I'm really happy to have you here with us because you work globally with so many women's organizations, and we're interested to talk about the trust and coherence in the groups you work with and how you're perceiving our collective evolution in this time of drastic change.
So yeah, thank you for having me.
Why don't you start first by just giving us a little bit of background on Madre?
Sure. And thank you for this project. It feels like a really important and also timely exploration. So I'm the executive director of Madre, which is an international women's human rights organization, a women's fund. And we work in very close partnerships, generally with small grassroots women's organizations in situations of war and environmental disaster. And honestly, more and more environmental disaster has come to mean climate change. And what we do with our partners is make grants to resource their work. The women that we're working with are doing what women all over the world do, which is to make sure that the basics of life are in place for their families and for their communities. And in situations of war and disaster, that becomes a really monumental task. And so making sure that people have the resources to feed their families, to make sure people have shelter, clinics, education, sometimes emergency and escape support networks for places where there's a lot of repression and that's needed, is really vital. But I think that, one of the things that's so clear from the women we work with is that they, want the same things for their families that everybody wants for their family, which is a lot more than just to survive, even though that's obviously a prerequisite when they're up against the really difficult circumstances that they live in. But they want to make sure that their families are not just surviving, but thriving, and their communities as well, right? And
so one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you is having gone through the fires in Northern California endlessly for 4 years now. One of my perceptions is that when people are in crisis, they have no bandwidth to think about the larger issues or address them or be involved in the community. And you've got women in the midst of crisis who are also working for their communities. So talk maybe about one of the groups and how Beyond the Money, Madre helps them stay resilient, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. It's like, until our basic needs are met, people really can't focus on, constitutional reform or policy advocacy or making better decisions about how we grow our food or run our industries or anything else. And yet, unless we can impact those larger decisions, we're going to be constantly recreating the conditions that have led us to crisis. And that's true in our own communities. You all felt it in Northern California. And it's certainly true of the war and disaster zones where we're working. And I'm thinking, just because I just got off the phone with her recently, of our partner in Nicaragua, where the community, an indigenous community, has been reeling from the impacts of climate change. From, last year, Nicaragua faced these two really destructive back-to-back hurricanes. They're reeling from the impacts of gold mining and other extractive industries on their territories, and many other crises that are the results of policies that were created not in that community, but very far from that community. And yet the fallout is happening very locally. And so it becomes so crucial for women in those indigenous villages to be able to make sure that, they can replace the bean harvest that was lost because of the hurricane, a very concrete, immediate need, but also that they can be in networks, and this is part of Madre's work, with indigenous women from around the world to influence climate policy, both at the global level, the Paris Climate Accords that are being administered through the UN and other international bodies, and regionally in Central America and nationally in Nicaragua. And that's no easy feat for community folks to be influencing policy. It takes a lot of organizing, because people, and in particular women, and in particular indigenous women who face a lot of discrimination, don't have a lot of access to power nationally or globally. And so part of our work is creating the sort of social movement infrastructure that's needed for people to have a voice on policies that impact their lives.
Nicaragua was a good example as any. Talk about how you've helped those women in those communities move from the male-dominant local government, the abuse situations, and the lack of powerness. What helps women in those situations become empowered and feel the strength of their connections?
Well, I think at the most basic level, what enables women to become empowered is joining together with other women. That's been true, across geography, across generations. We see that again and again. And it's not the case at all, though some people mistakenly think this, that we as Madre somehow get on an airplane, go to Nicaragua and empower those women. That is absolutely not how it works. And in fact, the partnership that we have is very reciprocal, and we've learned a tremendous amount, I would say, from them about our own power as people in our communities, as citizens, as activists. But there's an interesting thing happens to people who are poor, which is that they are told over and over again that they have nothing. And sometimes, unfortunately, they start to actually believe that. Mm. And yet, if you as an outsider were to spend time in these communities, you would be struck by how rich they are, not in money, but in connection to their territories and their lands, in connection to their past and present and future generations of their communities and their peoples, their deep understandings of the ways that they are parts of nature, the really rich philosophies and histories and cosmovisions that inform their relationships to each other and to the ecosystems that they rely on, is something that many, many people in this country are utterly bereft of. And so sometimes it's really valuable to kind of be able to, and this is part of the work that we do with our partners, sort of not empower them, but reflect back to them the strengths and capacities and assets that they have that we can see so clearly. It's, it's what our best friends do for us all the time, right? And so it is a version of that. And we, through a process of listening and reflecting back to people, work with them so that they identify their assets and their strengths, and then they use those assets and strengths to build political campaigns, to make social change. So it's a combination, I think, of starting really with some visionary ideas that people already have about the kind of change they want to see in their community and their society, and linking that in very material and strategic ways to campaigns about changing policies and practices.
So when Madre started, what, 40 years ago, more or less?
Yeah, 38 years ago, long time for an organization.
Was the vision, there's a disconnect with all the, or most of the groups that work with poor people worldwide. It's been dominantly coming in and fixing things. It's taken a long time to shift that to what you're saying about reflection, which is beautiful. It's the same thing you do with your friends, or you do in a healing situation. You reflect back to the person. But anyway, did the vision come from Madre? Was it a collective thing? How did that build that awareness that we in the West can't come in and fix things?
Well, I think for the founders of Madre, they were intent on fixing things, but the things that they wanted to fix were not in the communities of our initial first partner organization, which was this group in Nicaragua. The things that they wanted to fix was their own government's policy. Because Madre was created in 1983 at a time when the US was waging a sort of undeclared terrorist war against the people of Nicaragua, trying to use militias trained and armed and funded by the CIA to make life so miserable for people in that country that they would rise up and overthrow the left-leaning government that the US was critical of at the time. And so there was a campaign backed by the US in Nicaragua of extrajudicial killings and torture and using rape as a weapon of war, bombing daycare centers and clinics. It was very, very brutal, a scorched earth policy against poor farmers, very, very brutal. And it was not much in the press at the time in this country because it was happening sort of off the books unofficially. And activists knew about it and made common cause with people in Nicaragua. The women who founded Madre reached out to a group of women in Nicaragua to ask what they needed. And I think that continues, that very basic human question continues to inform a lot of the solidarity that we do today. Knowing that the United States is responsible for a lot of harm and destruction in this world, whether we're thinking of places like Nicaragua or Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria that have been under US bombs, or whether we're thinking of an issue like climate change, where the US holds, not sole, but very disproportionate share of the burden for the destruction that climate change has caused. There are a lot of ways in which fixing those things really starts with our own government's policy. And we want to make sure that we're doing that in a way that's informed by the experiences and the priorities and perspectives of those who are most impacted, which so often tends to be women in those countries. And
so I think that brings us to the question of seeds for our future. How, for example, do we shift from this barrage of problems into hope, into coherence with each other to really move forward? How do you see that?
I see it a lot in the lessons from the women we work with around the world, because they are people who are living through some of the worst crises we can imagine in places like Yemen or Haiti or Myanmar right now. And yet they have such a clear vision of how to sort of shift the trajectory of where things are headed. And they just really, really believe that the way the world is not how it has to be. And I think that that fundamental belief is something that is hard, can be hard for people to accept, because we've lost the habit, I think, of remembering things that we know to be true, but that our culture tends to lie about. We know that the earth and all of its inhabitants are more important than money. right? We know that people are part of nature and that we're all interdependent, but it is really hard to remember that when the culture is constantly sending out opposite messages, that money is the measure of all success, for instance.
So in a way,
So
you're saying that the belief of all these groups around the world is, in a way, it's a model for us, because we don't have that vision anymore that the world can change. We don't have the vision of what we need to do. I mean, in the US at least, there are little pockets, but we've lost a consensus beyond some progressive ideas. We don't have yet a consensus of the heart.
right, right, right. And we know that, the consensus that we do have, the dominant stories of like brought us to the brink of ecological and social collapse. So we really need to find different stories, right? Like the stories that will remind us of what people are capable of, and the stories that will put us in right relationship to each other and to the earth. And I think that, I often hear this assumption from people in this country that it's indigenous people around the world who are the ones who have a solid handle on these stories that we all need right now, that it's an indigenous worldview that is going to see us through. And I think that's true, but I think that the modeling that indigenous people are doing for us is not that, and here's where I see a lot of people making a mistake. It's not that everyone should adopt indigenous cosmologies and indigenous worldviews. It's that we should do what indigenous people are doing so well, which is to each of us go back to our own traditions to find the stories that are the most true and that are gonna help us navigate the challenges ahead and remember what is what we need to remember about people and what we're capable for, because everybody has those stories in their traditions, whether you're European American or Latin American or from Africa or whatever. And I think because indigenous peoples have not been severed from those stories, we can see so clearly that they're the ones who have it. And some of us need to do a lot more work, I think, to reclaim. But I think that's a piece of the challenge and the opportunity that we have right now.
Do you have a story that you could tell right now that represents that, a kind of shifting story that pops into your mind?
I was thinking about when we were talking about the book that you're writing and the series of conversations that you're curating, and you used the word spiritual activism at one point, and it made me think about sort of my own journey and the shifting in my thinking around this set of issues. And because I remember thinking when you used the term that that I'd like us to get to a point where we thought that the term spiritual activism was redundant, where we really would be able to come to see our activism as a spiritual practice. Mm-hmm. The ways that I feel, and that is something that I see some of our indigenous partners doing really, really well. And so I think about, the tradition of secular Jewish practice that I was raised in, for example. And that for me, I think gave me three things. Gives me, I think, a way to be in relationship with people all over the world who share that moral framework, even if I might not meet them, right? It gives me for sure a way to feel it connected to my ancestors. This Jewish practice is so much about sort of historical memory and transmission of traditions. And I think it gives me a way also to be in connection to future generations. And those are the same things that social justice work does when you think about it, right? Because all of us who are doing social activism are linked to people who are working for those same things all over the world. And, you may be lucky enough to work in collaboration with them, or you may not, but it becomes really important to know that they're out there. Mm-hmm. And I think, one of the things that people cherish about being part of Madre is that it gives them a way to be in common cause with people who share their vision of the world that they want to create, no matter, if their lives or their communities look very different. And for sure, I think social justice work is a deep way to connect to our ancestors. Like activism is always about building on the struggles of the past, whether we see that or not. Like that's actually what history is, right? And certainly, I'm very aware as I'm doing this work of leading Madre, the way that I am standing on the shoulders of women who came before me. And in a way, I do think of those activists as a kind of ancestors, and that the work that I do in this organization and to create social justice in the world feels very much like a kind of sacred obligation, because I know that people who have given their lives for this work. And
One
so
of
part
my-
of it is,
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, I just was going to say part of it also is just thinking about making space for that next generation, and that's something that we're really focused on with a lot of really vibrant, fun, important programming for girls all around the world.
Well, one of my own personal experience, and also was reflected by a statement by a young woman who said, we know how to go into a meeting, bring our agenda, decide what action we're going to take and go out. We don't know how to connect with spirit. And even though I was heavily engaged with feminism and nonviolence, which does have a spiritual component, the actual on the ground meetings for years and years, whether it was Vietnam War or nuclear power or community organizing, it's all about the agenda, and the heart is not finding a place. So talk about how, it sounds like in indigenous communities that heart is just natural. That's part of what you're saying about the spiritual activism, but talk about how Madre and the rest of us can build that more address that issue directly, because that's why I'm talking about spiritual activism, to get people to think.
Yeah. I think in our sort of political tradition here in the United States, that there is and not just in the US, I think around the world, that there has been a long tradition in left-wing movements of sort of denigrating spirituality, and focusing for good reason on historical materialism and and people's social and economic rights and needs, and a lot of I would say like suspicion of and also alienation from spirituality, and a conflation of spirituality with organized religion and all kinds of other
Right.
Things that cause people to sort of say, oh, that's not what I'm about. That's not what this work is. But I think we do ourselves a disservice when we do that, because and I'm not a religious person, and I tend very much towards that, very materialist orientation of building out the work. But I also really believe that we have to be able to do this work with our whole selves if it's going to be transformative, and not just transformative of, some policy agenda on a piece of paper in the State House or in the national Capitol or at the UN, but transformative of our own lives and well-being, right? And that is part of feminist practice of understanding the continuity between the personal realm and the political realm, right? So we got to do this with our whole selves, the activism, and part of our whole selves is something that a lot of people call spirituality. And I think that many of us get sort of hung up on the term spirituality and define it very narrowly, or define it from like a place of deep alienation, and we don't really think about spirituality being just a very innate part of being a human being, that's the sense that you have when you are feeling peaceful in the woods, that you can define that as your spirituality, or the
Well,
sense that you
connection
have.
in its heart, and our culture has largely lost connection and seems to have lost heart in some way that I don't even understand yet.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think that those of us who define in a primary way as activists and, social justice workers need to think a little bit differently about the realm of the spirit. And I think that younger activists are doing a better job at that. I think that there is a more holistic approach that I see coming from activists who are, folks who are coming up now, people in their 20s and 30s, who are not trying to keep this like distance between themselves and this thing called spirituality.
Hmm. Do you have ways of bringing that directly into the work with all your partners?
We work in a lot of places where people have experienced very severe trauma. And one of the tenets of our trauma healing work is that work needs to be sort of of the community that people are in. That many of the partner groups that we work with, regardless of how they might define it, have ways, some of them part of their spiritual traditions, some of them more ad hoc or more recently created, but they have ways that are innate to them and their communities of how they approach healing from trauma. And what that approach has in common, even though it looks really different in different parts of the world, is that it enables people to reconnect to the spiritual parts of themselves. And so, just for example, the women that we work with in Guatemala live in a village where many of them saw their parents massacred during the genocide, also backed by the United States in the 1980s. And this was when these women were children. They experienced, the worst that people can experience on a piece of land, a hill right next to their village, which was the site of this massacre. And in the work that we've done with them more recently, these are, women who are now adults, many of them now mothers themselves. And they made a decision that they wanted to reclaim that piece of land for themselves, that they said they had had enough of having sadness right next door, that they had had enough of, never wanting to walk across that hill, of always having all of their terrible memories back whenever they needed to go there. And they sort of repurposed a traditional Mayan ceremony to reconsecrate that piece of land. And they did that together as a community. And essentially what they were doing was just making an intention together that that piece of land was going to be, again, a happy place for themselves and for their kids. And I know that I'm putting that in very simple terms, but it was an incredibly powerful intervention for them and by them. And I don't know that it's not necessarily a clinical trauma methodology that they were using. They in conversations with us about the work that they wanted to do and the kind of changes that they wanted to see in their community, they came to that methodology. And this happened a few years ago, and they have a very different relationship now to that piece of land, and a very different relationship because of the sense of peace that they have that they didn't have before. I spoke with one woman who said that, when her kids were little, she had a habit of putting them to sleep at night with their shoes on, because when she was a kid, you never knew when you were going to have to wake up in the middle of the night and run. And after they did this ceremony on this hilltop, she said she felt like she could stop doing that now.
Wow.
And to me, that was such like a concrete expression of both the ways that trauma becomes intergenerational and that we transmit it to our children and to younger people, and the ways that with the right amount of the right kind of support, that people can be very intentional about making different decisions, and not just intellectual decisions, but really have the support to have choices about being a different way.
That's a really beautiful story. And, you know, in the shamanic work I do, we often are working with land that has carried trauma. You know, there's an immediate situation, but we discover that there's trauma held in the land for generations, not just in the people, but in the land itself. And so many cultures around the world have those kind of ceremonies. And again, in the West, we don't really, which is unfortunate, but we try to bring them into various places. I think of a story a teacher of mine told about Chernobyl. There had been a synagogue at the site of Chernobyl. And at some point, I don't remember what year, everyone had been burned inside. And then they built Chernobyl on top of that. So that land has held generations of trauma. And I'm excited to see in this, there's a lot of people discussing trauma and the collective trauma now, which is really exciting to me. There's different ways, like you say, of addressing it, but until we even notice it, we're going to be stuck by it.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting to me also in the work that we're doing in places where there's been a lot of trauma, to think about both about the way that trauma gets passed, you know, culturally and historically. I think in the same way that you're talking about land holding trauma, that there is a lot of new learning now about bodies holding trauma,
Right.
and that being transmitted also across generations. And, you know, I'm curious about whether or not we can do likewise and transmit resilience over generations, and whether we do that sort of, I mean, I know we do that historically and culturally, right? Because all of us many of us are beneficiaries of the ways that our families and our ancestors have overcome and survived and gone on to, you know, love and be joyful, even though they've experienced terrible things. But we somehow are so much more focused on the transmission of trauma. And so I just wonder about the possibilities and practically speaking, the utility of exploring what it means to be able to transmit resilience across generations.
And that feels like a definite seed for the future, right? It makes me think of an experience I had as a child. My uncle was a farmer, and he didn't travel very much, but when we traveled with him, we would stop by the side of the road. He'd get out of the car and he'd go put his hand in the soil and run the soil through his fingers to see what that soil was like there. That motion, which I maybe only saw a few times in my life, hugely affected both my brother and me in terms of connection to the land. Just that one. So transmitting connection is maybe not so hard if we shift our focus. And that's, and maybe you want to say some more about shifting the trajectory of in what, because I know you have to leave pretty soon, what kinds of seeds you think are useful in this time.
Yeah. Well, you know, I guess what I'm thinking of is actually, you know, something really concrete, which is how we use and share resources to be able to shift the trajectory. Because I think another thing that to me feels really important to change is the conception that we have about philanthropy in our culture and how that works, you know, where we have sort of set up this dichotomy where some people our philanthropists and other people are beneficiaries. And we lose, I think, so much of the really rich exchange that can happen when we shift out of that binary into thinking about partnership. And yes, resources need to be redistributed, and philanthropy is a great way to redistribute resources in this world. So it's not that resources are not like flowing in a particular direction, but I think it's really, really important to do that in a way that you are working with people who, like I said before, like share your vision of what it is that you're working to create. And when you're working in that kind of partnership, you can benefit so much as a person who's contributing resources. You can benefit so much from the teachings and the learnings from communities all around the world. And I know when we're making grants to our partner organizations, you know, we have some people who support our work who think of those women's groups as quote unquote beneficiaries, but certainly in their context, those women's groups are themselves, you know, further devolving resources and creating, you know, revolving loan funds and all kinds of participatory grant making processes and lots of processes to share resources to make sure that they are really making their way to the people who are most in need. And that's really, really vital. But I think it's also vital to do that with an idea of not just what we're trying to change materially, but what we're trying to change in how we all relate to each other.
Well, it's a really good example of what I think of as reciprocity, where I give you some dollars, they go to the women's group in Iraq. The women's group in Iraq makes loans to women so they can restart a business, you know, having a few chickens or whatever. And so it circulates, and it spirals, and that's in the indigenous worldview, life spirals. It's not a linear process.
Yeah, that's right. It's a great metaphor for it.
Yeah. What other seeds do you think we need to plant for our future?
You know, I think one thing that's really important when we're talking about social change work, and that is a challenge in our culture, is to remember that there is like often this under-recognized ingredient in social change work, and it's time. And, you know, a lot of people who are donors to various, you know, nonprofits or supporting social change work in a variety of ways, they don't really want to hear that it's going to take a long time, you know, because that's frustrating. And because
the 3-year grant.
Right. And things are urgent, right? So there's a very real reason why there is that sense of urgency. But I think that our expectations also are very much shaped by the consumer culture that we've all been brought up in, you know, where you make a donation and it feels a lot like making a purchase, even though you don't do that you do it from a different place in your heart. But that's what it feels like. It can feel like a transaction. And so I think it's, and then it becomes, I think, frustrating for people to recognize that social change work actually is not something that we have a very quick return on. And, you know, we can link social change to things that are urgent and need to happen quickly, like doing life-saving interventions. And that certainly is part of Madre's work. But I think we also just need to understand that the work of social justice is the work of generations, and that we can, I think, take some solace also in knowing that that means that none of us have to do it all because this work is not going to be finished in our lifetimes. And the way that we, you know, the opportunity that we have is to be in service during our lifetimes and do our part and understand that, you know, we are in this trajectory, right, of people who did this work before us and people who we are going to pass this work on to. And as much as we're contributing, you know, our work, our writing, our thinking, our money, our political activism, the whole, gamut of it, that we have to be able to have a long view of this work.
It's always been a challenge for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm thinking back to a Zoom call you did with some of the partners. There were 3 or 4 groups, and I loved how the women were so appreciative of their connections with each other, across continents. Is that a big part of what you do? And is that one of the ways you help build coherence and trust?
Yeah, absolutely. We call them often knowledge exchanges, learning exchanges, where the role of Madre really is to facilitate what you termed reciprocity between women's organizations in very, very different contexts. And, their communities might look really different. The problems that they're dealing with might take a different expression, but they have a tremendous amount in common. And often the best kind of teachers and role models and sources of solidarity and moral support for women are other women who have gone through what they've gone through, and I think that that's something that's familiar to all of us. You don't have to live in Syria or Colombia or Yemen or Haiti to understand that. But for us, our partners have told us that is some of the most valuable opportunities that we've created for them are their relationships with one another. And that.
And this time of COVID has made that much more pervasive for all of us.
Yeah, it's funny because it's been for us one of the learnings of this past year. And I don't know that we would have understood this if we hadn't had to live it. Exactly. Because like everybody else, we had to shift to doing all of our work on Zoom. And in March of 2020, we acted very quickly with some generous support from our donors to get Zoom licenses and laptops and internet extensions and all this communications technology into the hands of grassroots partner groups. And I'm talking about groups that are not people who are used to using, laptops and information technology in the normal part of their work. Some of the groups we work with have been doing that for a long time. Others hadn't done it at all. And I think we were holding an assumption that was a false assumption that the technology would be a barrier to deep communication and a deep ability to work together, partly because people weren't really used to it. And we were so happily wrong, I'll say. People were really eager to master the learning curve required. And for people who live in places very remote from, the cities and bigger towns in their own countries, the opportunity to be in close conversation with other women all around the world was just brought so much opportunity and joy. And, it's like we've all experienced this year, the ways in which Zoom can be depleting and alienating, but there's also an intimacy to it.
Yeah.
And they just sort of leaned into that. And so we were able to have really meaningful, deep, engaging conversations with women across a wide range of geographies and languages and contexts. Mm-hmm. And it's just been actually incredibly beneficial and really enriched a lot of the activist work that women are doing in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America.
That's fantastic. So any last thoughts on how we move the collective forward in this vast need to evolve quickly? In spite of the fact it's going to take generations. I'm talking about the level where there's extinction and humans may not survive, really. So
yeah, right. And that's the paradox, right? It's that it takes a long time and there's no time to lose. And I think that, again, I see the work that our grassroots partners are doing in countries across the global South. And I feel like those are such models for so many of us here, where people are working both to adapt to climate change as quickly as they can, changing the way they farm, changing the way they work, changing the way they travel. But also, again, like resurrecting the stories that are going to be our guides for figuring out what comes next and how we build that. And I think the one of the most important things that we need to look for are the kinds of solutions, and whether we're talking about policies or work that nonprofit organizations are doing or that community groups are doing, the kinds of solutions that really are at the intersection of solving multiple problems at once. Because I think if this past year has taught us anything, it's that we have entered into this time of successive, multiple, overlapping, cascading crises, right? They are so consequential and so big and so interconnected that we can't resolve them sequentially or little by little. And so we really need to look for these new paradigms that are gonna hold it all. And for us, what that means is, for example, making sure that as we're developing new policies and practices for communities to adapt to climate change, that those policies and practices are also upholding the rights of women and girls. Because we know that gender equality is going to be central to democracy, is going to be central to climate adaptation, is going to be central to creating alternatives to right-wing authoritarianism, is going to be central to putting our communities on the path that we want to do what our partners are working to do, what we all want, which is not just to survive, but to thrive.
So does that include women and girls? Does that also include the rights of nature? Do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we're being, I think, pushed to think about that more and more, especially by partners in Africa and Latin America. And in Latin America, as I'm sure people have succeeded in codifying the rights of nature into national constitutions and legislation. And, I'll share something that a young girl said to me recently when we were talking about human rights, and she sort of was like pondering the phrase a little bit. And she said to me, "Don't you think that's a really narrow term?" And I, we had a long conversation about that, and it just made me remember again, like how important it is to do this work across generations, and the direction that we're moving in, which is, again, like seeing humanity embedded in nature as part of nature. And if we as people need the conceptualization of rights in order to reintegrate ourselves into nature, then if that's a useful framing, then yes, I think the rights of nature is going to be an important paradigm for us moving forward.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much. This is a conversation that could go on for hours. I'm sorry we have to stop.
Me too, Meg. And I look forward to having a conversation with you. I'm picturing us like walking on your mountain, having a conversation. I would love to be able to do that with you one day soon.
Well, if we can move again, we'll do that. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.